Hi, I'm going to talk about my disease today, my illness, my healing journey that I've been on for the past 3 years. Probably just going to read this essay that I wrote and then meander off topic as I'm prone to. So I'll go ahead and just read this. So I began my journey with illness about 3 years ago. And it progressively got worse, and I sought a diagnosis, which was a long time coming. Now, at that time, I've always been interested in alternative health, and I ran the Evergreen College organic greenhouse at their farm, and I studied with a bush medicine healer in the bush of Belize, and had studied with Native American healers. So I already was very in touch with acupuncture and Ayurvedic medicine and naturopathy and homeopathy. And so I'm down with all of that, and I study it all the time. I find it fascinating to really think about the alkaline body and all these things that really fascinate me. But when my disease hit hard, I didn't go that route. I was like, what the hell is wrong with me? And I went and pursued Western medicine, which was incredibly time consuming and incredibly expensive. So it took me about a year of visiting emergency rooms with gastrointestinal issues. And it literally took me about a year of going to emergency rooms and being handed pills that didn't even make any sense to me. On and on and on with all these tests, which I'm about to discuss. But it wasn't until about a year into that process that I actually got a formal diagnosis. So I began my journey with illness about 3 years ago, and it progressively got worse. And I sought a diagnosis, which was a long time coming. The Western doctors did invasive test after invasive test, and they prescribed medication that didn't make sense without a clear understanding of the disease or even the symptoms. So for anyone going through the Western medical establishment, it takes years off your life, like literally, with doctors after doctor, and you're dealing with authority figure after authority figure, and ultimately they're not gods. And I think in modern day times, they're just worshipped as gods. But which is fascinating when you look at the history of the medical establishment and how originally doctors didn't even have to go to medical school to be doctors. So just fascinating. So you're dealing with authority figure after authority figure. So you need to factor in there's always this relationship between doctors and patients. That's not a traditional healing model for anyone who's actually studied healing, but you have this relationship where someone is in power. They're literally in power over you. They're in power over your body, they're in power over your wellness, they're in power over your life, in a sense. They are holding the tools or the Pandora's box or whatever they have it, right? And you don't have it. You're in the position, oftentimes laying down, subservient in terms of body language. You're laying down and you're at a lower level of interaction with those doctors. And we aren't really taught that we are allowed to ask questions of the doctors, or question their authority, or question their decision making, or question their tests. We're really taught like a mentally well person just accepts and just does whatever the doctor says, even if it's pills that ultimately studies indicate lead to cancer or lead to disease themselves, or the pills have horrible side effects. We're not really taught to ask questions about that. And it's interesting because most people have been indoctrinated into this. So if you actually try to talk to most people who are pro-Western medicine and you encourage them to ask questions or challenge their doctors, oftentimes they become they've just become culturally indoctrinated into really not asking questions. So it's almost like you're putting forth the concept of like revolution to them. They're just kind of like, well, you should do what your doctors say, as if doctors are gods, and they're not. And maybe because I know enough doctors that are total idiots, and like, I'm not saying they're not great people, but just doctors are like any other human being on this planet, which means, you always have ego playing into anything. You always have your own biases playing into anything. You always have your own unresolved childhood issues, or karmic or dharmic issues, or past life unresolved issues. Like, everyone's a complete human being, so they're going to have their own issues, and they're going to project that onto the experience. So We don't allow ourselves to really conceptualize that when we observe human interactions. We don't really allow ourselves to see that every human is coming to the equation with their own biases, and every human is coming to the own equation with their own insecurities, their own frailties, their own woundedness. They're carrying around these wounded children, within their own psyches. So anyway, it takes years off your life because you're in that position of dealing with authority figures, and you're dealing with the authority figure after authority figure, and ultimately they're not gods, though they are worshipped as gods. So you're dealing with the whole Western medical establishment's ego. So there's actually an ego to the whole Western medical establishment. If you can understand and conceptualize, when Jung talks about the ego, there's also a sense of the collective ego, which is the collective ego of the Western medical establishment. You're at the same time, you, the patient, are feeling powerless. You're feeling alone, with all these authority figures poking and prodding at you. And for almost a year, I spent a lot of time in emergency rooms. I spent my time getting 2 different MRIs. I had CAT scans, I had ultrasounds, I had x-rays. I had expensive test after expensive test under bright, glaring light. I stared at ceiling after ceiling, noticing the little dots, noticing the artificial light, noticing the pale faces in the rooms without windows as they stared down at me. So some of the eyes, like of the doctors or the medical staff, there might be like smug satisfaction that they have some knowledge that enables them to feel more intelligent or more educated or more aware than the patient. There can be indifference in the energetic field or the soul consciousness of the person. They may just be doing their job and care very little about the health of the person. So you're kind of taking on all of that as you're in this vulnerable position on your back. You're kind of like that beached whale, and you're at the mercy of whoever finds you on the beach, and maybe they are somewhat indifferent to their own lives, So what you're educated about more than anything else through that process is that you are the patient. There's kind of like a role, and everyone's got a role, and you're handed a script. And as a patient, you're no longer the expert on your own body. Like, you've been in this body your whole life, but unfortunately you're kind of like no longer the expert. That the expert position's been vacated, and handily enough, the Western medical establishment is happy to fill that spot. So you're no longer the expert on your own life, on your own body, on your own experience. So one experience I had was, I had asked the hospital, I said, hey, can I have like the most cutting edge gastrointestinal specialist that you have? Like, I want to be consulting with the person who's like advanced and who's like ahead of their game and who's really considered like the best that the hospital has to offer, because I don't want to fuck around with like intern doctors or something. Like, I want someone who really knows their shit, right? So when I requested this, and I was working with this gentleman, he had diagnosed me with Crohn's disease, despite the fact that I had 2 MRIs that did not prove conclusively that I had Crohn's disease, and none of the biopsies taken during my colonoscopies indicated that I had tested positive for Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, which were the 2 diagnoses that I'd been given. One was a rare form of ulcerative colitis that happens for older people and long-distance runners, both of which I'm not. So I was left with more questions than help during that process. But regardless, they provided me with plenty of drugs from the get-go. From the emergency room visits, I was prescribed medication that was meant to stop tremors in your belly or stop any kind of spazzing out of your internal organs. I mean, just random drugs that if you looked them up and looked up like rats and medical studies, it was all very concerning. A lot of them seemed to be like a straight shot to a colostomy bag if you took them long enough, or you would have surgery and part of your colon would be removed. Like, just lovely things that people should just be passive as fuck about, apparently. So, this gentleman who I saw, who was reportedly like the key doctor above all doctors, that was upheld as being like the dude who really knew his shit, he prescribed me medication that, when I had done the research on that the drugs were linked with cancer and long-term surgery and colostomy bags and so forth, and he didn't really have anything else in his arsenal. And I think most doctors, they, let's face it, need to feel special. They need to feel like they're, even if their research is funded by big pharmaceutical companies, they need to feel like a success for having achieved medical school and passing, their medical school exams. I don't know. Like, I remember this key moment where I had spoken to him about the success of fecal transplants and if you study fecal transplants, and just imagine how old Chinese medicine is, and they've been doing fecal transplants since like the dawn of Chinese medicine, like with babies, feeding them poop from a healthy baby for a baby who has gastrointestinal issues. Like, and now, I mean, obviously we're in a different place in time. We're no longer feeding babies poop, but like, anyway, there's a lot to be said for fecal transplants. And if you can avoid medication and do your own fecal transplants to replenish the bacteria in your intestines, which when they look at like Amazon Indians who have like the most diverse bacteria in their intestinal tract, and what you see now in the research is that most mental health is really a lot of autoimmune diseases. A lot of mental health, if you look at the research, is clearly linked to the biome, is clearly linked to the gut. If you stretch us out in our intestines make up the majority of what we are. We're basically one long tube that's all packed up inside of us. But that tube is actually the life of that tube. What's in that tube, the biome. You see all these people that are obsessed with Acidophilus, right? Which are little tiny critters. And sometimes folks have a hard time understanding that we're like 90% non-human DNA in our bodies anyway. So we have tons of animals living on us. We are literally like our own little universe. Tons of animals living on us. We have creatures in our eyelashes fornicating and shitting right now. Like, we're just covered in little animals living in bacteria and so forth, but inside of us as well. So anyway, I brought up with this gentleman. I was like, hey, like, what do you think about fecal transplants? And could you do one here at the hospital for me? I was looking into a donor and I was really investigating that. And he's like, oh, there's no proof that fecal transplants actually help with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't know if I said that. Like, I don't know if I said, are you kidding me? But I literally was like, what? And then I just felt so upset about that, because then I pulled up on my phone this study that was done at Children's Hospital within the last year that showed success in treating children with fecal transplants, like who had Crohn's disease. Like, what the F? I was like, this is the dude who's supposed to be like on top of it. This is the dude who's supposed to be like, I spend like hours every day researching like the most recent studies on how to treat these diseases, and like, this dude doesn't even know this. He lives in the same friggin' city as Children's Hospital. I was like, oh my God. And there's something that happens to you when you literally have to be educating the doctors that's kind of just annoying. It's kind of like, Jesus fucking Christ, like, why am I responsible for educating you when you are taking my money and you're supposedly supposed to be an expert in your field? Like, that's just, he should be embarrassed and ashamed. But I'm sure he wasn't, doctors and their egos. So I was discussing with him the success of the fecal transplant studies, and I was asking him to do a fecal transplant to facilitate that there at the hospital. I was working on a donor. I had my sister and my cousin lined up to be donors. So it's a fascinating procedure. I haven't pursued it yet. So I just would like you to keep in mind that this gentleman was lauded as the most advanced, the most up-to-date doctor at this hospital. So I just want that really put into context. And what was striking was that at that moment with the doctor, I calmly pulled out my phone and I pulled it out, the research study done at Children's Hospital in Seattle, Washington, and showed him the successful treatment of processes with fecal transplants and Crohn's disease. And he expressed surprise and appreciation that I was bringing this level of awareness to him. But what I would like to speak to is that it's incredibly draining. It really is. Like, there's no way maybe to quantify that except maybe have like some, I don't know, opinion survey you fill out before or after dealing with your doctor. But there's something that happens to you energetically, and Dr. David Hawkins talks about that. when he does his energy scales, where literally you'll go into like a situation, you'll be at like a 3 or let's say a 7, and then someone will bring you down to a 3. Like the environment will bring you down to a different level of energy. There's something that happens is demoralizing. It's depressing. It's psychologically and spiritually a downer, a bummer, something that can happen when you're going to this extra effort and you're having to educate people that are supposed to be helping you. So it's incredibly draining emotionally, psychologically, spiritually when you're already dealing with chronic disease. And it's like chronic disease that people can't see, because people would look at me on the outside and they'd be like, I don't see anything wrong with you. And you're like, well, my disease is inside. So I don't know why that's a problem. Like, so people would struggle with like, you don't seem like, why don't you have the energy for this or whatever? Or why can't you go hike this mountain? And you're like, because I have this disease. And then, so you're already dealing with this psychological impact of having a chronic disease that's not naked to the eye. So you're already dealing with all these emotional implications of having to educate people that really you don't even want to have to try to educate. If you're missing a leg or something, it's more obvious. People might leave you alone. But when it's in a chronic internal disease, we don't have a lot of sensitivity for that in our culture for autoimmune disease. So then to have on top of that, having to educate your doctors, but somehow like with the white male establishment of Western science, it's like so beyond like being able to receive criticism or responsibility for its lack of inclusivity with holistic medicine. It's literally on the patient themselves. Ultimately, that's the sad truth of it, is like in this white Western male, like non-inclusive of holistic medicine, white male, patriarchal, non-inclusive of holistic medicine, Western medicine, the patient then has to find the strength to stand up for their rights and ask questions. So for example, a lot of the medications that the doctors were trying to push on me, I'm like, I've researched these, and have you researched these? Like, these are scary meds, and the propensity is that people end up with surgery or they end up with cancer. Like, look at the lab rats, like, who would want to ever take this shit? Like, why wouldn't you work with alternative medicine providers once you have a working diagnosis, right? So they were scary as fuck, these side effects and also the implications of the meds. And it was just, for me, it was like immoral to be on this medicine cycle where they start us with vaccines and then they give us meds for the diseases that are now prevalent, and then we end our lives being on more meds. And then so it's just this cycle of sickness that I see more and more. It's like, why do we need concentration camps or internment camps when you can just keep people in this cycle of debt where they're constantly ill, and pretty much everyone I know has something? It's very scary. But that's a whole other theory. So 2 of my doctors were actually supportive of helminthic therapy, which is the worm therapy. And there's 2 different kinds of worms that are currently being used, which are the hookworms and the whipworms. Primarily those 2 worms. And I did a lot of research, and there's 2 big support groups on Facebook. I did a lot of research on this. So it's all based upon the hygiene hypothesis, which, if you're not familiar with the hygiene hypothesis, basically we already are filled with bugs and critters and bacteria anyway. And about 150 years ago in industrialized nations, when we started wearing shoes and having latrines and having vaccines and having antibiotics in our food supply that we're getting from the beef and the animals that we are consuming and so forth, we get rid of the larger of the, like I call them the whales in our biome. It's like most of the world, do the research, most of the world have about 50 on average of hookworms in their belly. Not industrialized nations, non-industrialized nations. We're not talking about people who have a surplus of like thousands of hookworms and are anemic. We're not talking about that. So it's interesting that they are developing, these big pharmaceutical companies are currently developing vaccines against hookworms for Africa and Asia. Like, that for me is mind-blowing, because they could be creating the same autoimmune diseases that are now plaguing Western nations. So just so we're just on the same page here, if you pull up a map, and I wish I could just show that to you right now, If we pulled up a map right now and showed you all the diseases that are prevalent in industrialized countries that are not prevalent in non-industrialized countries. So we have autism, we have rheumatoid arthritis, we have lupus, we have MS, we have irritable bowel syndrome, we have Crohn's disease, we have ulcerative colitis, we have major depressive disorder, we have schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, allergies. Now in the US, like 1 out of 2 kids is allergic to something, dander, pollen, cats, dogs, whatever. There's a whole host of these diseases, right? But they're only popping up in the last, even like ADHD, they're only popping up in the last like 150 years. So it really correlates if you look at the history and you look at the topography of where in the world these autoimmune diseases are happening. They're only really happening in industrialized nations. And what's the commonality in these industrialized nations? They've eradicated these worms, which were kind of like our bodies evolved with these worms, and the worms were something that keeps our body busy because we're fighting this kind of low-level little thing. It keeps our body busy. It keeps our immune system with something to do. We evolved. They took blood from us. We give them something. They give us mucus on our intestinal tract, what have you. Keep in mind, most of the world has these worms on low levels of these worms, but not the industrialized countries. But you don't see major depressive disorder or autism or MS. You don't, or ulcerative colitis or IBS or Crohn's disease. You don't see that in non-industrialized countries. You really don't. Not anything that's substantial that really merits commenting on. So anyway, 2 of my doctors were supportive of me doing the Helminthic therapy. Meanwhile, I had to pay out of pocket for that. Now, the pharmaceutical companies make about $35,000 a year from MS drugs for one MS patient. So it's fascinating to me that the FDA doesn't allow the hookworms into the country. And hookworms last about 5 years before they get killed off, unless you eat something that's going to kill them off. They're natural anti-parasitical agents. So for someone to get hookworms, they would have to go to like Canada. Let's say you get it mailed from the UK and pick it up in Canada. That's about $200 for each time you do hookworms. And I haven't done whipworms yet, but the hookworms are just a vial. They're microscopic. You cannot see them. You put them on your skin, and then they go into your skin. They travel through your body, and then they end up in your intestines. But you can't see them. You just feel the prickly rash from the hookworms. So people are using them for treating all kinds of autoimmune diseases. If you go on the Facebook group, there's lots of files for talking about people's success stories and treating different diseases like restless leg syndrome and so forth. So it's really fascinating. And the thing is, it's like people can always do it and start it out small and do like 5 worms. Like I started out with 25 and then I got up to about 200 worms. But you never know if some like died off in the process, and you never know if some died, somewhere else. But what's interesting is how ignorant people are about this. Like you can pull up study after study showing that they're using worms to treat disease. They're using worms with the premise that the hygiene hypothesis is real. We've become too clean. We've eradicated our little friends, and most of the world has these little friends, and we actually need them. And then when you factor in the FDA and how they allow whipworms in, which die after like 3 months or something, so you have to replenish the supply. So it's always back to the money. So the FDA allows whipworms in. They'll even allow hookworms in if it's a medical study, but they won't straight up allow hookworms into the country. So you literally need to like go to somewhere else. There's a place in Mexico you can go. All over the world they're shipped except for the US. You can have them shipped to Canada, But I noticed an immediate improvement when I started with the worms. That definitely got my disease like kind of under control, but I did not ever do the medicine that they wanted me to do. Thank God. Like I just read all these horror stories about people's side effects with those meds. And once you get on the Western medical cycle, it's really hard to get off of that. I think the healthiest people are people who are not taking any Western medical meds, like ever, even Advil. Like I'm just totally opposed to these things. So let's see. So 2 of the doctors were supportive of that, but they it's literally something that like my insurance wouldn't pay for. Like they couldn't just give me the money that goes towards my insurance and let me use that money the way I want to, right? I don't want their stupid medicine. I don't want their like cancer giving to rats medicine. I don't want any of that, right? I want to steer clear of them as much as possible. So I'm the one who had to do all of that. I'm the one who had to pay the gas money and pay the cost and get the worms. And like, I'm still angry about that because money matters. And when you're struggling, like that's an additional cost. And I've actually talked to people who have autoimmune diseases, different autoimmune diseases, or even depression, because people are using it with the concept that major depression is caused by your biome. Like there's people out there that are totally open. And I've said to them, like, if they have different diseases, like, have you considered hookworm therapy or what have you, you know? And some of them are actually receptive, but they're like, well, I don't have the money. So it's terrible that money is a barrier for well-being when the Western medical establishment is supporting these drugs that are really horrendous, and that a lot of times the research is completely generated by the pharmaceutical companies, you know, which I don't trust. So two of these doctors were supportive of me doing that, but they appeared scared of being held liable. Like one of them brought it up with me. They were like, have you considered Helminthic therapy? And I was like, oh, like what's that? And they're like, it's basically like worm therapy. And I'm like, oh, you know, but they were living in a place of fear about it. Like, it's not like they could openly talk about this or openly like put it down in my chart notes or anything. So it's not like I could challenge my insurance company and say, oh, the doctor really supported me for this. It was more of like a off-topic conversation that I'm supposed to be kind of mum and, you know, hush hush about, which you're not doing anything wrong. Like we evolved with these creatures, these little tiny pets, you know, kind of like the little birds on the back of rhinos and all those Africa photos. Like we evolved with them. They give to us and we give to them, and they're our little pets on the inside. You know, it's just crazy to me that we have to be like hush hush about this. But anyway, they both appeared scared of being held liable. And there really is this fear within the Western medical establishment of getting sued, and people are scared to go outside the box. And then that's what gets approved by pharmaceutical companies in terms of prescribing to their patients like only what the pharmaceutical companies basically have pushed. But there is a whole bunch of research out there on Helminthic therapy. I mean, some people criticize it because they'll do like a low level of worms and they won't do a higher level of worms, and then they'll say like, oh, the results are inconclusive, and you're like, well, why did you do such a low level of worms, and why didn't you study the patients for longer than like 2 months, like, and see if the worms, because for some people it takes longer for the worms to really have an effect. But it's all based on the hygiene hypothesis. So pretty much there's an indication that all of these autoimmune diseases, even mental health diseases, are based in the gut. So if people could treat, just think about if you are a pharmaceutical drug company, if all these people could treat their autoimmune diseases and treat their depression and treat their schizophrenia, or at least offset it, or address autism or something with the helminths, with the worms, like, you would do everything in your power to block the worms from becoming something that people know about or that they can get easily, you know? We do acidophilus, which is so crazy for me because they're little critters, and you'll talk to people that are like, yeah, I'm all about my acidophilus. And you're like, well, why aren't you into worm therapy? Why wouldn't you be, you know, intrigued by worm therapy or open to that? And they're always like, oh, that's disgusting. And you're like, I'm sorry, you're putting creatures in your biome habitat now, but somehow that's disgusting. And I have friends who have autistic children, and I just don't understand like why you wouldn't let your kids, they would get exposed to hookworms if you took them to Africa, like, and let them walk around barefoot for a while. Like, it's just crazy to me that people aren't willing to open their minds to Helminthic therapy. But anyway, mental health diseases based in the gut, the correlation that we see in first world nations with a lack of biome diversity in the gut and the implications. And then we have lots of animals, right, and critters living on us and living in our ecosystem. And we are pretty much, we've lost these whales in our habitat, right? But we evolved with these whales in our habitat. So what really stood out to me in my search for therapy and treating diseases based upon the hygiene hypothesis is how closed-minded. Okay, so what stood out to me with my my process is when you feel alone and you are you feel like you're kind of alone with the Western medical establishment, and then you are alone because you are researching treatments that the world in its indoctrination into Western medicine has been taught phobias that are almost reactionary, and they can't be open-minded. It's that cognitive dissonance. They just cannot be open-minded and can't really open their minds to thinking beyond whatever the TV is telling them or whatever the CDC or FDA is telling them, as if these entities have always protected people's rights. Like, you really can't, you lose a lot of energy trying to educate others who, for whatever reason or not, have bought into their own enslavement, and that's part of, they can't see the chains that bind them or bind their consciousness, and you really just have to kind of let that go and let them suffer in their mediocrity and their boringness. But what's interesting is that it was really hard for me, I would say, emotionally. Like, I tried to help my aunt who has an autoimmune disease, and that didn't go very well, and that was extremely disheartening for me. And I suffered because I wanted to not just raise people's awareness, but bring healing to people that were close to me. And in particular, I had one friend who would often disparage me publicly. Like, I'd post stuff on Facebook about worms, about helminthic therapy, about like research article after research article about the suppression of the studies, about the validity of the studies, about the origins of the hygiene hypothesis and what it might relate to. And what I was met with was not just ignorance, because ignorance is disheartening, and ignorance can cause us to kind of retreat into our own little shells. But I actually met almost like cruel opposition. I mean, it was just bizarre. So the one friend who would embarrass me publicly, he caused me pain, not just from his ignorance, but from his attacking that he would do. And what I'm such an introvert, and I'm such a sensitive person that literally I just kind of retreated into myself, because it was really hard for me to come to terms with the fact that, like, I lived in such a closed-minded world. Like, I really was just so taken aback. Like, wow, like, these are people in my life who I now have lost respect for, and they're so closed-minded that I just can no longer respect them. Like, I can still have love for them, but I don't respect them. I don't respect their minds. I feel like our minds are a gift, and if you're not using yours, I don't have a lot of respect for that. And so when people purposely choose ignorance and they don't choose to seek to educate themselves, I really don't have a lot of respect for that. And you can't control respect. You either have it or you don't. And you just lose respect for people, and that's really hard, because you don't want to end up being one of these people that can only hang out with people who think like them, right? But I'm just really annoyed by ignorance that's almost like a form of patriotism. It's like, I'm going to be ignorant, God damn it, and I love my country. And you're like, yeah, you sound like a doofus. So that was hard too. Like, it was one thing to have a chronic disease and feel isolated and feel sick and not have anyone support me. My dad, I think, was a decent supporter. I wouldn't say my dad ever took the time to research any of my ideas, but he wasn't an asshole about it. So I would say my dad was a support. And I'll always love my dad for that. But in general, I would say I slipped into a depression, and I definitely was like, wow, it wasn't just the disease that was causing the depression. It was also coming to terms with the fact that I lived in an ignorant world where people are not open to the hygiene hypothesis and they're not open to that, but there's all these diseases linked to it. And I couldn't understand, like my friend who had an autistic child, I couldn't understand her unwillingness to really explore that, because even if you give your kid like 5 worms and you notice a slight difference, or 10 worms, you know, like I said, I'm like on 200 worms, right? Even if you give your kid like 5 worms, like that's something they would pick up in Mexico, you know, like why not just do it? Like if I had an autistic child, that's what I would do. And it's not just my pride, like what, you don't trust me that I've done my research on this. It's beyond that. It's just this sense of how prone people are to going the route of Western medicine and not actually exploring the basis of disease and really looking at autoimmune disorders and why everyone seems to have them. Everyone seems to have an allergy. Everyone complains about pollen. And what if it's not the pollen? What if it's the biome diversity of your guts? You know, I just don't think people realize we are our guts. Whatever is happening in our guts is what's happening to us. And now they're saying that leaky gut syndrome, which is very common, if you talk to naturopaths or homeopathic doctors, they're saying is directly correlated. It's not a wheat allergy, but it's glyphosate that is sprayed on the wheat, which we already know is not even the wheat of our ancient ancestors. It's like this new hybridized wheat that's not even really wheat anymore, that in Europe, you know, they don't have. So I think people in Europe don't maybe have as much of a reaction, but the glyphosate that they're spraying on our food, in particular wheat, right at the time of harvesting, is literally destroying our guts because it's poison. So basically, they are poisoning us and giving us cancer-causing agents, which are then broken down in our digestive tract and resulting in what's called a leaky gut, which is you're having proteins, you're having different things that are coming through like the cellular walls that are hitting the bloodstream before they should, because the protective barrier between the rest of your body and your intestinal tract is not solid. It's got spaces between the cells, which is not good. It's bad. And there's a lot of things that correlate with that: exhaustion and chronic fatigue and tiredness. And it's just interesting to think about politically, because why would you need concentration camps or internment camps if you could just keep everyone kind of sluggish and tired and sick all the time, or low energy, which basically glyphosate seems to achieve. So moving on. So I went through a spiritual metamorphosis in that I was kind of out there on my own, other than my hookworm therapy group, you know, which not like we got together in person. It's like it's an online community, so therefore, like, however close you can feel with intimate strangers over a screen. But I mean, I totally appreciate these people, and they were on it. And I think there's a certain place you can go with conversations when everyone's on the same page. Like if everyone's like, JFK was assassinated by our government or something. If everyone's on the same page for that, you can go a lot farther with discussing various theories about why and who and how it all played out than folks that are like, oh, no, that's like crazy, because you spent a lot of time, energy trying to educate ignorant people, and you lose where you could go. It's like, if you can't build your spaceship, and if you agree how to build your spaceship, you can't get to the friggin' moon. So when people are on the same page and everyone's like, yeah, hygiene hypothesis, totally valid. And the worms as a treatment, totally valid. And lots of us are having success with the worm treatment, feeling much better, totally valid. Then you understand that you can get to a deeper place and have more profound discussions and actually get somewhere with these discussions, actually achieve something in your discussions, because you're not meeting all this stupid resistance that you meet with normal people that are like, I'm just going to watch the TV and the doctors will tell me what to do because every doctor in the world is awesome and they totally are like little gods and they know everything, and we are the humans and we know nothing. So, and the one friend who would publicly disparage me, and people would reach out to me about it and say, like, why is your friend publicly disparaging you? A lot of that seemed to be fear-based, but I was not able to get like a spiritual perspective on that for like months and months and months. of really thinking about like, what is it about our own sense of fear, something that threatens us. And so sometimes our cognitive dissonance is threatened and we're going to become reactionary because we don't want to think that there's voter fraud going on. Because if we think that there's voter fraud going on, we need to then doubt the belief that this democracy is even a real democracy, which it's not. But like, so when our ideas get threatened, when our assumptions get threatened about a safe world that makes sense, that this is reality, a person who's in a fear-based state is then going to launch an aggressive attack. They will put you down, they'll demean you, they'll publicly humiliate you, you know, all these things that happened with this particular friend, which ultimately in my own spiritual evolution became less about the friend. You know, he's just a stupid guy, he's just a friend, he's just in his own fear state and not open and not aware, and that's his own spiritual journey, which he probably won't accomplish in this life, but maybe the next life, you know, keep praying. It became less about the friend, who I love regardless of the harassment and the lack of support and the open defamation, the public defamation, because I have a sense of humor about these things. Like, people don't understand that about me. Like, I really do have a sense of humor about human nature and how idiotic humans are. But the part that was really hard in my own evolution was understanding how deeply people I loved were tied into their belief constructs and not shifting and not changing their belief constructs. Like, they could only grow maybe within this narrow margin. They weren't really willing to have revolutionary ideas that shifted and changed their lives. Like, I always love these movies that are like the man who's living this uncomfortable life that's totally fake, and he's in this unhappy marriage, and he's just thinking, I'll just die and stick it out. And then one day he has a fucking epiphany and he's like, fuck this shit. Like, I need to live my life for me and I need to be happy. And I don't care if I'm single at 60, but I just love stories like that. I love stories where people hold themselves accountable and really look at their lives and are really willing to take uncomfortable steps in their own evolution to really challenge themselves and do that work on themselves, to really look at who are they and who are they beyond this construct of identity and ego. Who are they truly, right? So it's just bothersome to me when I just realize more and more, like, wow, these people that I love in my life weren't really willing. It was beyond the worms, you know, it was beyond me doing the worms. It was recognizing like a shift in my life. Like, everyone else is going down this one road and me and the worm people are going down this other road. And I kind of felt like, even though it was primarily like this online community, but I kind of felt like, fuck it. Like, I kind of want to stick it out with the worm people. Like, I kind of want to stick it out with people that are willing to challenge themselves in their paradigm and really look at healing from a completely different perspective. I'm in love with these questioners. I'm in love with these people that really are okay being on the fringe and are okay challenging the establishment and are asking critical questions that need to be asked and that aren't like playing it safe. You know, I'm really annoyed or bored by these people that just play it safe and just kind of do what they've been taught and they don't challenge themselves, you know? So it was an epiphany on a lot of levels, but it was very lonely. I would say it was a very lonely time for me. Because I love the people in my life so dearly. Like, I love my relatives. I feel a sense of deep commitment to my family, and I love my friends, right? And so to feel disheartened by these people and realize that they were not willing to really look at the worm therapy and really be open to the worm therapy, it became less about the worms. It became more about my realization about their comfort level and what they could take on with their minds. I just felt like this ship took off and I was on the ship with the worm people and they weren't. And I don't know if I'll ever circle back and they'll be willing to get on board with the worm idea or not. But like, I just felt like with that worm stuff, I went one way and they went one way, and my biome has the worms and theirs don't. And I don't know, maybe it shifted my consciousness. Maybe consuming the worms through my skin shifted my consciousness. I don't know. I'm not trying to say that I'm better. That's not really what I'm trying to say at all. So, just more kind of repetitive stuff. But around that time, I explored how helminthic therapy. I tried some other worm from England, but it was a worm that the FDA was allowing in, but of course it died after like a month. So every month you had to get a fresh supply, and it was like $60 versus the 200 for hookworms that'll last for 5 years. And I was like, interesting. The moneymaker worm, another moneymaker worm, is being allowed into the US, and I couldn't afford it, right? So I was experimenting with these different worms, and then I did the hookworms. So I traveled and I received the worms, and I did the worms for about a year. So about every 3 months I would add more. And I definitely had some success with that in terms of my disease. I would say my disease was like in code red, and then I don't know what's like 3 down from code red, like code blue maybe. But I also saw the Chinese doctor and the Japanese acupuncturist and my naturopath, and I saw spiritual healers because I totally believe in the whole body and soul and spirit being, I mean, I was totally annoyed by people that are like, if you just talk to your disease, or if you, I mean, it's such a bullshit, but they would just be like, if you could just talk to your disease and figure out the psychic reason for your disease and make friends with like your childhood enemy or your past life issue that you did. And I'm like, just like, bitch, are you serious? Like, I lay in my bed all the time, like trying to meditate, like, and think about my disease from a spiritual perspective. Like, I just think some of that new age shit is just bullshit. And people don't realize when they're saying that to you how, I mean, I've done it to people, but they don't even realize how they sound so pompous and ignorant, and just, for someone who's suffering with a chronic disease, you really don't want to, I mean, it bothers me still that there are some people out there that truly believe if I could just meditate enough and do enough spiritual enlightenment, I would be able to like heal this disease naturally, like all Mary Baker Eddy-esque or something. Like, it's not like I'm not a Christian Scientist appreciator, aficionado or something, but yeah, I don't believe that. So anyway, so I saw spiritual healers. For some people that's too much, but for me, I totally believe it's anything in our lives is affecting us, from whether it's your aura. I mean, I know energy workers that work on like looking at the aura of your heart to see if your heart has like a wall around it, and they'll work on reducing that energetic field around your heart. Like, I mean, look at shamanic healers since the dawn of time. Like, of course, there's totally good reasons for looking into all of that. But there's an environmental impact as well. I mean, there's a relentless chemical warfare going on against our bodies, which people are pretty clueless about in general, in terms of air quality or poisons in our food, or even poisons in our fabrics, in our cars, LED light exposure. Like, the stuff is finally coming out about LED light exposure and how effed up it is and how much it messes with our eyes and our eyesight. But I really do look at things holistically. So I was going through the drainingness or the depression from feeling isolated from my friends and isolated from my family, who weren't willing to support me with the worm therapy, or weren't willing to listen to me about it. And it hurt my feelings. But it was more than just like, listen to me, do what I say. It was something more profound than that. I mean, I'm still wrestling with the implications of that. But like I said before, it felt like I was on a boat and I'm leaving with the worm people and everyone else is back on the land. I mean, that's really the only way I can put it right now. I was disheartened by their lack of willingness to look into the research and how it impacted potentially the implications for their own sicknesses. Because ultimately I'm a healer and I want to heal others. I think that's part of the conundrum of any healer, is that you're constantly doing your own healing work, but hopefully you're also trying to help other people. So what came out for me as a feminist from my friend, who was extremely derogatory and cruel in terms of making fun of my treatment and publicly humiliating me, was that I got to be that crazy woman on the street. And I think we're all very familiar with the crazy woman on the street, because if you look at Simone de Beauvoir, you know, she really talks about that. So to be the crazy woman on the street, I mean, it's pretty much the verbiage that everyone goes to, men and women. They're just kind of indoctrinated into this sexist bullshit, but it's the crazy woman on the street with the messed up hair, you know, and all of her cats. You know, it's this image we have of a way to put women into this box. And as a feminist, any time someone disparages me along the lines of being crazy, it just it brings up the implications of what that does to women worldwide, and the association with mental health. And we uphold people like MLK Jr. And Malcolm X and Gandhi, but we don't uphold women that challenge the system. Like, we really teach ourselves that women can only challenge the system within very specific ranges, that women are allowed to challenge the system. So I think we become very threatened, because we're such a sexist society, by women who challenge the system. And basically, once they can label you as crazy or a hippie or any of these like negative words, and it would be interesting to look at the gematria of some of these words, but once they can label you with these things, these words have power, and it negates everything about you. It pretty much makes your word and your opinion irrelevant. It kind of just strips you of your power. So friends who joke and humiliate you for your crazy ideology don't even realize, potentially, because they don't have that higher level awareness, but they don't even realize that they're not only perpetuating stigma associated with mental health and women, and falling into that trap of humiliating women along the lines of mental health. Like, I'm going to dismiss you. I'm going to say you're a crazy bitch, you know, a crazy hoe. And that will dismiss that female intelligence challenging, you know, we're just going to call her crazy. We're just going to call her a hippie, like whatever they do. The person doesn't realize who's doing that. Usually they're not intelligent enough to really get that part. But by checking the crazy box on people, it just taps into that indoctrination. It's a patriarchal culture. We're going to dismiss this woman, call them a bitch or a hoe, call them crazy. So then basically I'm reduced to fighting a battle with my body, which is already at war with itself. I'm fighting a battle with the friends that aren't supporting me, or the family member that I mentioned that wasn't supporting me, or wasn't open. I would say that was the more upsetting part, was the lack of openness and coming to terms with someone's closed-mindedness. But I was also fighting the battle with the Western medical establishment, right? Because I had my fecal transplant idea. I had my worm idea. I mean, all these things that and then the Western medical establishment was like, let's run more tests. Let's give you more pills that are linked with cancer in laboratory animals. And what's fascinating is I had 2 MRIs, and then only after that did I read the stuff about the contrast, and how they're now showing that contrast that's used for MRIs, in particular one type of contrast, is totally relates. There's several lawsuits that have successfully been won because there's a correlation with cognitive decline, quite significant cognitive decline. I think one of the lawsuits, the woman completely lost her job. She was like an engineer. She completely lost her job. It's like, they tell you this stuff is fine. They pump you full of radioactive substances or whatever it is. And then lo and behold, you lose your mind. I mean, it's just lovely. So that was disheartening to read the stuff about contrast. And I would encourage anyone who's had an MRI to really look at that. I mean, it's just heartbreaking, because you trust these doctors, you trust these people, you ask them like, oh, is it safe? And they give you some stupid canned response. I mean, go and do your own research. Which I didn't do. I mean, I did the research on the contrast after I think my second MRI. And they both were inconclusive. Like, neither one proved that I had this disease. I mean, it's crazy. They gave me this diagnosis when every biopsy didn't show it. From internal biopsies, little snippets of your internal, body that they take as samples. I mean, it's just crazy. So I was fighting the battle with the Western medical establishment, and I was fighting the battle with my insurance, which would only cover one kind of treatment. I was fighting a battle with the FDA in terms of they're not going to allow it to come into the country. I mean, so there's this sense of who's the FDA there to protect? I mean, really, look deep at the FDA. I mean, I've known people who've worked for the FDA, and they themselves have slandered the FDA. So FDA won't allow the worms in the country, but we've got lots of cancer-causing meds out there. I already talked about the MS drugs they're raking in about $35,000 a year from those meds versus hookworms, which are 200. So basically, it's all about the money. Because really, if people want to do hookworms, friggin' let them do hookworms. Like, what are they going to get? Anemia? I mean, really? What's the big deal? So I always feel like it's about the money, and disease and money are highly correlated. In the process of getting my treatment, I was also taking a ton of herbs and a ton of treatments that I had to pay out of pocket for, like acupuncture, etc. And I certainly wasn't cured, but I wasn't as bad as I had been, and I definitely had made improvement. I was still there's a certain point where your worms can have less efficacy because some conditions will kill off the worms sooner. And I wasn't quite sure if there was a point where I could go and get more worms, which I'd traditionally just been getting more worms, but I decided to open myself up to some other treatments. So at that time, this was like about 7 months ago, I got a different diagnosis. The Chinese doctor, and she does Japanese acupuncture and auricular ear therapy, she said, I think you have severe food allergies. And I was like, really? I said, would severe food allergies mimic Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis? And she said, definitely. She also said, I think you have leaky gut syndrome, which I mentioned earlier is quite pervasive if you talk to naturopaths or homeopaths. And it's about the destruction of that interior lining for your intestines. The intestinal wall becomes compromised, and whether it's from glyphosate or what have you, all these people are having inflammation issues, which relate with inflammation issues. All these diseases related to inflammation. And even depression really is linked with inflammation. So she said I had severe food allergies, and already I wasn't doing wheat or dairy, but she added about 10 other foods to that list, which I have to admit, since not doing those foods, things have been better. But I actually had gone on holiday in the tropics, and I had a severe setback with my disease. I'm not sure if something I ate had killed the worms, because sometimes you'll eat food you don't even realize it has anti-parasitical properties. So, generally I was trying to replenish the worms about every 3 months. And when I went on holiday in the tropics and was severely ill, I think that was kind of like a breaking point for me personally, where I realized my disease I needed to step up my game and do something else. Either I needed to get the worms like I've been getting, I need to get them and replenish the supply again. Or I needed to do something different. And So what I chose to do was take the Chinese doctor, Japanese acupuncturist's opinion to heart and treat it as leaky gut, but also after I was severely ill in the tropics, I went on a series of, herbs and so forth that has certainly helped strengthen me. But I also did better about really avoiding these foods that she said just are not good for me. Because a lot of times, like, I think I'm just anti-authority by nature. And so even though I adored her, I still was like, well, I still feel like I can eat these things. And like, what does she know? And that's what's so nice about like an elimination diet or something, is you start to figure out what are your food allergies and what are you being triggered by. And it was hard for me because there's certain foods that I really like a lot. I have a little bit of an obsession with goat milk. People think I'm joking when I said I was going to marry goat milk, but literally I would have married goat milk. I was in love with goat milk. So really hard to give up goat milk. And like beans, like it's a bummer to give up beans because all the time you go places and people are like, have some hummus or have some beans, or this is some yummy, like a burrito or something. And you're like, I'm not doing legumes. I mean, it's a bummer. It's just sad to give up certain foods that you liked and enjoyed. And maybe, after your intestinal tract heals, maybe she can retest me and I can eat some of those foods. But, it's a bummer to have to be responsible and follow a specific diet. But I was in such dire straits after the trip abroad to the tropics that I basically was like, no, I absolutely need to do something. And so I put my health in this woman's hands, even more so. Like, I feel like I just kind of came to her. It's almost like a spiritual practice when you're giving yourself over to any kind of healer. But I just felt like I'm like, heal me. Like, just, whatever you say, I'll go take the herbs you say, even if they could potentially harm my worms. Like, just, give me whatever herbs you think. But, sorry, it's just these notes don't correlate with what I was on topic about, but if I could just diverge for a moment. This was a note that I'd written to myself about the MRI drug, and how the contrast was linked to mental decline. And basically there are some people who've just been literally rendered stupid. And I had written about how it was hilarious. I mean, it's sad, it's pathetic, it makes me angry, but that the Western medical establishment is always telling us that radiation and things like this don't matter. They're very big on discounting all of these studies that I think are suppressed that talk about the dangers of radiation. So much of our pollution right now is this radioactive energy, or radiation-based energy, electromagnetic radiation. Like, we're just these science projects and people don't even realize like the fog of the electromagnetic radiation that's happening all around us. But this is about how the Western medicine, if you ask them like, hey, is the contrast that you're shooting into my veins for this procedure, like, how safe is that? What are the long-term studies showing? And they're like, oh, it's no problem. And then you research it and you're like, lawsuit after lawsuit. But if you question things, there's this real dismissal that you're a worrywart, if you question these things, that you're the problem child, you're the, black sheep of the family if you question these things. Like, heaven forbid you don't agree. Heaven forbid if you have questions, right? So there were the implications with the contrast. So I was on that search for that definitive diagnosis, right? Which I never really fully got. All I got were the doctor's best guesses on the diagnosis. But anyway, eventually I had another bout of sickness that really set me back. But again, with some people with the worm therapy, they have to get the worms more often. And I was due for another round of worms when my health took a dip. And I could have also contributed to that by having ingested things which were anti-parasitical. But for whatever reason, I felt called to not do another round of the worms, but try something else. Because my worms could be like fine with where they're at. Like even if I lost some, I feel like I'll get them again. I'm actually interested in getting the whipworms right now, which are more expensive. But I just am very intuitive, and I'm just not called to do the worms right this minute. I feel like whatever amount I still have is still sufficient right now, and I just wanted to pursue some other options as far as treatment for disease. So I had the bout of sickness and was really ill for about a week, and more like 2 weeks, but really sick for about a week. And Japanese acupuncturist said that I had caught like a new virus or caught something, and she gave me medicine that I'm still on right now for that, whatever that is. And the thing is like I said, I gave myself up to her, so I stopped I just tend to ask so many questions, but I stopped feeling like there's like questioning her, like, well, what other virus, and where would I have caught that other virus and everything. Like now I'm just like, okay, I'll take, it's a herbal blend. It's like not valerian root, but it's nothing that's going to hurt me. It's totally natural. It's interesting that I'm not even questioning her at this point, that I'm just like, oh, okay, you think I have a virus? Like, how did I catch a virus? Like, where did I catch a virus, And she probably doesn't have time to answer my questions anyway, but anyway, so eventually I had this other bout of sickness that really set me back, and I wasn't sure if I need another round of worms because they can die off and you need sometimes to replenish them. But I just had this very clear message that kind of came to me about hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatment, which is fascinating because you can get it in England quite cheaply, but in the US it's a pain in the butt. And I remember I called the insurance agency and just had this nasty conversation with them because they were like, well, we'll pay for it if you have cyanide poisoning. And I'm like, so if I purposely give myself cyanide poisoning, you guys will pay for it? And the woman's like, don't give yourself cyanide poisoning. Like, bitch, I'm not going to give myself cyanide poisoning. Like, please. But, I was trying to make a point here, which is I would need to give myself cyanide poisoning, apparently, to have you guys pay for this. So why do I have insurance anyway? Like, I understand if I have a desperate need and, like, chop an arm off and need to go to the hospital. I get it. But, like, do you know how many diseases people get from going into hospitals, or how many medical mistakes are made a year? Like, a lot. You should research that. So I just think we should have more control over the money of insurance. We should be able to use the money for what we want to some degree. And if I wanted hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatment, and that's the crazy thing, is like, after doing a lot of research on that, it's so helpful for all of these diseases. Like, I try to make jokes about it because I'm always a joker, but like Michael Jackson had this in his home, and so did Jenny McCarthy and what's his face, her old boyfriend, and she uses it for treating her son's autism. And since I've been going to hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatment, I've been seeing lots of autistic kids. Autistic kids also do chelation therapy, and they do hookworm therapy with success, or so I've been told. So I don't understand. If your kid is young and the brain is still growing, why aren't you doing that stuff? I really just don't understand it. I understand sometimes people are satisfied with whatever they're at for their medical treatment for autism or something, but like, why not step it up and do the very most you can do? Why settle for anything? I pursued the oxygen therapy, which is $4,600. So for someone whose life savings are $4,600, like that means that they don't have a safety fund for if they don't have a safety fund if shit goes down and shit gets real, or you need a new roof, or your kid gets ill or something. It's like, who has that kind of money? And then, I mean, I had it, but it's not like I don't have other expenses. It's not like I don't have other things that are pressing that need to be paid for. I just felt like I needed to do that. I just felt like the hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatment was going to be a success. And I wouldn't say that I'm healed at this point, but I've had good things happen with my disease and my digestion. So I'm not running to the bathroom all the time, and I do feel increased energy. Like, I'm not working out every day like I used to. Like, I haven't even really started that yet, but like, I'm really starting to feel more like myself again. And the thing is like, I'm also doing this ghee treatment, which I'm going to visit with a Ayurvedic doctor here shortly, hopefully in the next month. But like, in Ayurvedic medicine, ghee is like the number one kind of like line of defense. It's considered holy, and they have their own spiritual beliefs around the ghee. But the ghee, and I was just talking to my naturopathic friend the other night about this, the ghee has short chain fatty acids, which are basically, it's like a really quick way. Your intestinal wall is needing those short chain fatty acids to create a non-permeable barrier between whatever your gut is digesting and it leaking into the rest of your body. So I've been eating this grass-fed ghee for about a week, and just things are like so much better for me with my intestines and my intestinal discomfort. And I'm just like in love with this ghee. I just can't believe that I've had it and haven't really been consuming it to the same degree. But now, like, I feel like I want to eat ghee like morning, noon, and night. And supposedly there's this beautiful fast you can do where your bile for your liver gets recreated or replenished, because you're kind of forcing it to almost restart your bile again. And how you do that is you don't eat fat, any other fat for the day. You eat a non-fat diet, but you start out every day. This is this cleanse with ghee. You start out every day with eating a huge amount of ghee, and then no fat for the rest of the day. And then it forces your gallbladder to create more bile, or create a new supply of bile or something. It sounds awesome. And maybe sometimes your bile's toxic. Like, maybe you need a new fresh supply of bile. But then another thing, they also say that there's a toxic load on our livers with how much toxicity we're taking in with our food, and the toxic load on our livers is like, that's why people should do liver cleanses. It's just the toxic load that they're exposed to with living in this industrialized society. Obviously, if you live on an organic farm in the middle of nowhere, that's great. So the ghee seems really amazing, and the hyperbaric oxygen chamber, even though it's time consuming and it's not as high quality as it would be in the hospital, I found to be really helpful. Like, a lot of people have told me that my skin looks lovely, and the skin is, your largest organ. It's definitely going to reflect your inner health. But for me, I'm still waiting for that inner health stuff to figure itself out. Like, I'm not cured. I mean, I wouldn't even say I'm in remission, but I am going to work with a homeopath to see about more study of what foods I'm allergic to, and really learn about, trying to, because Western medicine with allergy testing is not as sensitive, as the blood test with homeopaths and so forth. So, but there's also these things with the ghee, where they have enemas that you can do as well with the ghee. And I haven't given up on the fecal transplant, and I'll probably do the whipworms when I can. But the hyperbaric oxygen chamber, like when people give me feedback and they're like, oh my God, like your skin looks so lovely. And I'm just like, well, that's great. And, if I was doing skin commercials, that might help me out monetarily. But I'm less concerned with how I look physically. And I'm more concerned with what's going on inside my body, because this has been going on for 3 years. And this disease has hugely impacted my life. There's so much that I used to do that I haven't been able to do. And so there are no words to describe that when you're finally starting to get your health back, especially for these diseases that are autoimmune that people cannot see. Like, yes, I'm totally thankful that I never went down this road of taking the Western medications. Like, they're bullshit as far as I can tell. Like, everyone I know who's on medications just seems, their overall health seems compromised to me. Like, I'm just not a fan of Western medicine. I understand its purpose, but I'm not a fan. And the hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatments are really fascinating. Like, when you think about the science behind it, and I mean, it's just another reminder of diseases, like even rheumatoid arthritis, or, if people aren't open to hookworms or whipworms, like, would they be open to a hyperbaric oxygen chamber? Like, I always wonder, when people are closed-minded, like, would they be more open-minded to something that doesn't involve little critters? Like, it's so interesting to me where people are closed-minded. And it's just sad to me. I mean, it's sad to me that people are closed-minded. So, the hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatment has been helpful thus far, and I don't regret it. I don't regret it, and I'm trying not to regret the money part of it, because ultimately, if my disease goes into remission, and I have to ask myself, was it the worms? Was it a combination? Was it the hyperbaric oxygen chamber? Was it the ghee? Was it the herbs that the Chinese doctor and the Japanese acupuncturist gave me? Like, ultimately, money matters, but money is not, your health has no, even your mental health, like, there's no price that you can put on that. And it's so important to be a healthy human being and live your best life and bring your A game to the table. And we're not a very understanding society when it comes to illness. Like, when you are sick, people really, it's almost like they think it's catching, they really don't want to be around sick people. And so when you're relieved of that burden, it's like a psychological burden that you carry alone. It's very lonely. When you're relieved of that burden, it's really fascinating, because it's almost like a liberation from an internal prison that no one even knew that you were in. You're kind of like, wow, I'm literally starting to feel like a human being again, like I'm part of the human race, like, welcome back to the party, And people might just be like, oh, I thought you were at this party this whole time, I didn't notice that you were missing. And it's like, yeah, my health has been compromised now for like 3 years. It's been horrible, and I wish that we weren't so base in ableism in our society, in terms of, like, we don't show a lot of pictures of people that are differently abled. We really kind of exonerate, or not exonerate, but we uphold these people. We worship these people that are forever young or forever able-bodied. We don't really see people who are not able-bodied as being just as valid in terms of, maybe Stephen Hawking, but, like, in general, I think we're very uncomfortable with sickness. We're very uncomfortable with people that are chronically ill. And it's stuff we don't really like to talk about. I mean, I think it bores us because we're so consumed with, perfection and some idealized, plastic image of perfection. So again, I found this tremendous relief thus far with also trying to rebuild the intestinal wall with ghee and the shorter fatty acids. in ghee. But the Chinese doctor did tell me that a lot of leaky gut they saw as being caused by glyphosate, and that basically they're putting all this crap on the food and it's breaking down our intestinal walls, which is just friggin' heartbreaking. Because if you can keep people sick and keep them constantly on that path to wellness and like not always feeling 100%, like that's definitely, there's political implications to that when you think about how the rest of the world has dealt with glyphosate. Like, it's poison and we're putting it on our food. We shouldn't be doing that. There should be people who have a problem with that, and apparently we're all cool with it. It's really bizarrely strange. Like, I feel like I'm in Fahrenheit 451 or 1984 or Strange New World, Brave New World, I don't know. Just, what the hell? But thank God for ghee, right? So ultimately, I think it's amazing to feel like less angry or mad or depressed, because when you start to get your health back, you're not, I mean, I know people think politically I'm upset and I'm angry politically, but personally, like, if you know me, I'm a happy person and I joke around a lot and so forth. So it's always funny when people think I'm like depressing or angry, and I'm just like, yeah, my politics are angry because the world is depressing, and I think if you're not angry, you're not awake and you need to wake the fuck up and da-da-da. But in general, like, people that know me know that, like, I'm a happy, loving, peaceful person. You know, the way I try to treat people is kindly and so forth. But usually I'm making jokes all the time, and usually I just make fun of everything. You know, even if I have my politics, I still am able to, you know, be jokey about pretty much everything and always cracking jokes, except with this disease that has impacted me. And it's, you know, amazing to feel less angry or less depressed or less, just to feel like a different person. Because when you're in chronic pain, it totally impacts like who you are. And on the inside, people can't see that. They don't know what's going on for you physically and how that relates to how you're assimilating nutrients. Because with Crohn's disease or IBS or any of these things, like, basically you're not having time to digest any nutrients. Basically whatever you eat is going like right through you. So you're not assimilating any nutrients. So someone that appears like they're getting enough food literally are not getting enough nutrients. So they're basically kind of dying on the inside when you start to think about nutrition. So that's pretty messed up to have people think that you are physically okay, but really on the inside you're not. So like, why I'm sharing is that it's such a liberating experience to like finally be, like, I don't want to say in remission, but like finally see some light after 3 years, like whether it's the hookworms or it's the hyperbaric oxygen chamber or the ghee or the herbs or the acupuncture, the Japanese acupuncture, and she does auricular ear therapy, which is fascinating too. But like, it's so fascinating to me, like, at what point, I don't want to say like, oh, it's clearly this or clearly that, but like, to start to regain health, like when it's been taken away from you, because I'm still a relatively young person, and I think it's been really hard for me to come to terms with a disease that I have no control over. You know, it's just been really a humbling process, and very lonely and very isolating for anyone who deals with chronic disease and who suffers, but who's, you know, I know with the Western medicines, you can have symptom relief, but then you have the long-term implications, or you feel tired all the time, and then there's like cancer and all these lovely things, or surgery down the road. I mean, you're really on this like conveyor belt that's leading eventually to like a colostomy bag or cancer or something. I mean, statistically, on average, most of these people are not getting better and living great lives. Most of them are fat or have weight gain or are sluggish or tired all the time, or their livers are kind of have a lot of toxicity. So these meds have side effects. These meds have links to other health conditions like cancer later on. Like, and so many of these people have surgery, and surgery itself can be very risky. I knew of one woman recently who had surgery and the surgeon accidentally perforated her colon, and now she'll have a permanent colostomy bag, even though that wasn't the plan when she went in for surgery. Gotta love doctors. So, and I have doctors that are friends and that mean well. They're not all assholes. I have one doctor friend who worked for the Makah tribe, and he's so open-minded, and he brought up the worm therapy with me. He's like, I heard about like worms being used for IBS or Crohn's disease, and I was like, oh, that's crazy, because that's what I'm doing. So I don't mean to be an asshole about like all doctors being assholes. That's just me kind of making fun of doctors. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was, obviously Western medicine has a place, and I think if you follow my story, if you compared my story with someone who took all the medications that the doctors had prescribed, literally from the time that I was in the emergency room, antispasmodics, everything they gave me, just crazy stuff that I just went and got the prescription filled, and then I was just like looking at the, the side effects, and then also the long-term studies, pretty much all of them, cancer with laboratory animals, and I just was like, fuck it, like, why am I taking antispasmodics? Like, all kinds of random drugs like that. They just can these pills out like candy. So they were just guessing, right? Just guessing. And they were giving me random medications at the ER and so forth. But if you compared my story with the story of a person who did what they were told, like ultimately it's kind of like this lesson in do what you're told. Your doctors are like your new priests of the new age, the new era, and we're going to give you your medicine and you're going to do as we tell you to do. You're going to be a good little patient, and, mommy and daddy will love you forever. And then you compare my story of a person who asks questions and basically does their own treatment, basically conjures up their own treatment, which takes a lot of energy and a lot of belief in yourself, because I was surrounded, like I said, by my relative, by my good friend, and then another good friend, people that I didn't feel were supportive and that I thought were openly dismissive, even to the point of being attacking. And so the lack of support that someone like myself received just makes the whole process even lonelier. And then you have to be a really strong person, not just to stand by your convictions in the face of basically discrimination, because people are so brainwashed with the Western medical model, and they're so brainwashed into not asking questions, like to see asking questions as being somehow like anti-patriotic, like somehow you don't love this country if you ask any questions about the Western medical establishment. Somehow you're like a terrorist or something, right? Like you're going to end up on a terrorist like watch list or something. It's lovely, the intimidation in this country. But if you compared my story with someone who took all those pills, like that woman I just described, who I know through her husband, whose bowels got perforated during what was supposed to be a procedure where they were just taking the intestines out to rest them, and that they told her she would not need a colostomy bag, and they ended up perforating the intestinal tract and creating a hole that they couldn't repair. Whoops. If you looked at the long-term implication for folks that did do what they're supposed to do, did do what the doctors told them to do in terms of what did their kidneys look like, what did their livers look like long-term, and if you looked at what the laboratory animals, and just think about sometimes what they're reviewing for the laboratory animal research study isn't always properly reported anyway. I mean, it's not like results have never been suppressed before from any kind of study which can be linked with pharmaceutical companies. I think it's just the nature that people have, is that they become accustomed to doing what doctors tell them to do instead of questioning the establishment. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm all about questioning the establishment and that I live for questioning the establishment. But doctors, even if there is that huge ego piece on average, I see how fallible doctors are. I mean, I see that they are humans, that they make mistakes, that they're governed by ego, are governed by the big pharmaceutical companies without realizing it. So you really just need to look closely at every individual person in terms of who's prescribing you what and why are they prescribing it to you, and anyone who would give you any medication. And just really always be discerning, because when you give your health away to someone else and you let them be the decider, you're not only giving your health away to somebody, but you're giving some of your own self-governance away. And that I think there are ways to be healed or to get healing that really do work and that work holistically with your body. You know, like natural healing is a good thing, and it's unfortunate that Western medicine doesn't work more collaboratively with holistic healers. Like, I know that there's a program at Bastyr that will literally help people get off psychotropic meds and work with them slowly to implement other ways of treating mental health. Not just with nutrition, but there's lots of herbs. There's supplements like SAMe, which are not going to be as damaging. You know, and Europe, I think, is very fond of using SAMe for depression. But most people, when you tell them that, are kind of like happy with their medicine and they don't want to pursue the Bastyr program. You know, which is fascinating to me, because I just think that natural is better. I think your body knows how to heal itself. And I've just worked with such amazing healers that use nutrition and use food and use plants to heal. And there's such a difference. Like, if you notice someone who's using natural medicine, for me, there's such a visual difference between what that person's skin looks like, what their eyes look like, what their breath smells like, you know, what's happening inside their bodies, than people that are on a bunch of meds. I mean, it really is like night and day, and I would encourage you to look into that. So I'll end with saying, you're in this healing journey, you know, as a person who's receiving healing. And I think that healing can be a beautiful process, but when you're in the heartbreaking trenches of it and you're all by yourself and no one is supporting you, though I would say, you know, in my case, my father supported me, in some ways, you know, as much as he was able to with his own limitations. But I would say that my father was probably my primary support, which is hilarious to me, because my father's about as anti-alternative medicine as you can get, and could truly use an epiphany, gigantic proportions in regards to his own health. So it's kind of this dry irony to me that my father, of all people, was like my number one support. But I think he just loves me and was not wanting to argue with me, probably. So he was a good doobie. So when you're in the heartbreaking trenches and you're in it by yourself, and you're all by yourself and no one is supporting you, I mean, that is the worst. I mean, that was probably the worst part of it all, was that I was doing this all by myself without support, except for my dad. And oftentimes those are the times that we remember. So when they talk about PTSD and how we go back to a certain, something triggers us, but we are hardwired to go back to this defining moment where we learned who our true friends were, where we learned, you know, that our boyfriend was an asshole. Like, there's just these moments, you know, that we can just never forget. You know, for me, when my mom died, it's like these moments stick with us, and they're part of our like mainframe. They become part of like the hardwired mental landscape, the topography inside of us. And so for me, those are the times that we remember, is that we remember why we were all alone. Like, however we come to terms with that, like, why were we all alone? Like, What was it about our ideas that threatened other people? What was it about our own healing journey that other people couldn't stand by us and be there for us, or be there with us just to hold our hand during that process, or be a support, or be a comfort, or support, literally be a support. Like, maybe some people in my life could have taken the time to research the hygiene hypothesis and really understand like why I was putting worms inside my body and why I thought they should put worms inside their bodies. Like, I don't know how many people actually are that open-minded to do that, other than obviously the people in my worm group, And so those are the times that affect us, is that we look back and we know, we come to terms with why we were all alone, and it probably never really helps heal, but we come to terms with why we were alone, and we come to terms with why no one supported us. So now I can look back and I know who was there for me, and ultimately it was me, right? That was who was there for me, is I was there for me. I can't say that my mom was there for me. She wasn't able to be there for me. I think she would have been there for me had she been able to be there for me. But, I was there for me. To be honest, like, that pretty much was like the only person who was really there for me was me. And that's, I think, a journey worth having regardless where sickness or illness can take you. Is sometimes like we'll go through a bad divorce, or we'll go through a bad period in our lives, and we'll learn like a different form of self-reliance, hopefully not a bitter one, hopefully not one where we are angry towards the world as a result, but like ultimately when you learn to rely upon yourself, it's kind of like McCarthyism. Like, everyone around you is living, kind of like today, living in this place of fear, and there's almost like that McCarthyism scare going down, and all your friends are buying the bullshit. And what happens when you're smart enough, because maybe, I don't know, your brain's not addled with fluoride or something, but like, let's say you're smart enough to realize like something's up and this is fucked up and these people are lying and the TV's lying and the pharmaceutical companies are lying or whatever. And you realize this, and you come to this realization, and then you're kind of like the party of one, and you're standing by yourself, speaking your truth, and you literally are by yourself in that process. You literally are kind of all alone in that process. And how lonely that can seem, because we all need human companionship and support and validation. And so when no one will validate you, and you're pretty much the fool, the crazy woman with the cats and the mussed up hair, I think there's something that can happen there, which is quite positive, which is you learn to accept rejection, and it doesn't have the same power over you. You literally don't have to be part of the crowd. You literally are okay being a party of one, because ultimately truth matters to you more than assimilation, and truth matters to you more than public acceptance, if public acceptance comes at that kind of price where you're morally and ethically not at peace with yourself. So I think it's a lonely road to travel, whether it's internal illness that people can't see and people not supporting you, and you're on your own and having to navigate your way back to health by yourself without that support that you were hoping and wanting to get. I think it's beyond that bitterness that can just kind of poison people for the long term in terms of how they relate to the world. Hopefully it's something far more beautiful, which is, yeah, you can be lonely, but you realize like you don't need other people. Like, you don't need other people to validate your experience for you. And I think ultimately that's the greatest gift you can ever receive in a lot of ways, because I think so many of us are beholden to others' opinions, and that limits our functioning. And if we could truly speak our truth and validate our own internal voice and believe in ourselves, we wouldn't need others' validation in the same way, or their ability to hurt us by not supporting us or not validating us would have less impact, Not that you just become like a cold motherfucker, but like you literally just don't require that as much. You're kind of like, this is my opinion. This is why this is my opinion. And if you don't agree, I'm sorry, but like, it's not something that you're going to lose sleep over because you're at peace with your beliefs. Peace out.